Hello, welcome. Get your names down. If you've had a chance to look at this week's assignment, it's different, right? In format, usually I have argumentatively written pieces and ask you to analyze and evaluate. But in this case, I'm asking you to choose a topic, to choose a question to address, and then to do a little bit of research. Now, I still consider us on quasi COVID terms, so I'm not expecting you to be able to do, something really uh, just impressive as far as secondary and primary sources from a library. Still at this point, especially being an online class and this being a 1 week assignment. So I will keep that in mind, okay, as we look to these questions. As you see here, I give you an introduction to the 20s, right? And what I do is nothing new at all. It's rather commonplace. Is I put it within the context of the culture war. The culture war, right, was just quite simply those who were embracing the changes of the 1920s versus those who were opposing them. All right. So oftentimes on a given issue, those who opposed it called themselves traditionalists, and those who were embracing the changes of that decade oftentimes called themselves moderns. All right. So that's kind of the culture war that we find ourselves into in this decade. And it's so resonant that it's the easiest, quickest one to choose when you try to choose discourse, right? Some type of dialogue on a given time period or topic. It's the go-to one for the 1920s. All right. So as I put here is please read the introduction. All right, and try to give an introduction somewhat to a lot of the data I got was found in Alan Brinkley's textbook, and then that which wasn't, I have New World Coming was a really good book on the 1920s that I heavily quoted from or paraphrased, etc. So at any rate, in the 1920s, for the first time, Brinkley states that you have an urban country. You have more people living in a city of 1,500 people or more in the country for the first time. And so with that urban, bent comes this new urban culture. A lot came with it, especially in the big cities. So for one, right, is you have the introduction of nightlife with electrification, and you have jazz music in particular took the country by storm. And it's also interesting that the jazz music, by and large, came from African Americans in the Harlem Renaissance that was going on throughout the country, but particularly in Harlem, New York, during this time. And so with the also you have for the first time I have here the change, the economic boom that came with it, that for the first time in quite some time, at least into, I would argue, since the 1740s, per capita average disposable income took off. In some places as high as 37%, but overall it was into single figures. But so you have more people who have more money after they pay their bills, after they pay all the necessities, money to play with, basically, and you have more temptations and things to offer in the cities. Okay, and so you have the birth of modern day advertising. And with advertising, you're going to advertise everything that we're familiar with now, clothing. But one thing that you could oftentimes assume with the advertising is almost none of it were technically staple necessities. Everything now is or so much is a luxury good. Okay, a luxury good. And so you have the beginnings of things to also help out greatly decrease the amount of time that it takes to do one's household chores. So the dishwasher and the washing machine, the refrigerator, etc. Things are going to really expedite things at home and give women in particular more spare time. All right. So then you have lots of things with nightlife. So remember we talked about the growth of popular culture in the 1890s, and that's really has come of age by now. So the movie theater, the places to ride roller coasters and so forth. Those amusement parks have really come up in number. Dance halls and places for concerts, etc. You have shopping malls as well by the 1920s, and so a lot to utilize your time and to spend your money on. And so at this time, Hollywood is really going to boast of these changes, and you're going to see such changes on the big screen, and you're going to hear about it and read about it in the newspapers and novels, etc., about the exploits of these Hollywood stars who seem to have been really smitten with this new change of culture and are living a very fast lifestyle. The president himself, Warren G. Harding, and his cabinet developed a very kind of wild reputation for their house on Pennsylvania Avenue, whereby they would take bribes for different jobs in the cabinet, for different construction contracts, and then also infamously to have the federal government turn a blind eye to alcohol amidst prohibition here in the 20s. And so the prohibition was really kind of an anomaly, right? It was kind of a out of the ordinary cultural, attempt by the conservatives, their kind of last gasp, if you will, to try to impose some type of Judeo-Christian conservative standards on the population. And as you know, from depictions of the 1920s, prohibition was largely flaunted. But in particular, what people were very just unnerved by was the difference in particular with women. The number of women that were going to college tripled, and so hence they tripled where it was the time for these women to choose a husband and to kind of live and enjoy themselves in their youth and their adolescence prior to marriage. And that was unnerving to conservatives, because just prior to this, right, you had the Victorian era, and the Victorian era was really big on, well, let's face it, double standards with men and women. It was under the assumption that you cannot control men. There's almost no point in trying. But with women, they were supposed to be just very modestly dressed. They're not supposed to act as if they enjoy sex, even within marriage. It was very, to some people, oppressive to women, the Victorian era. And now it seems like looking at the women on the big screen, looking at women in the big cities that are going out at night, because a lot of them had jobs, or a lot of them were in college and had some disposable income. were able to, it was unnerving to the conservatives. So they did a little a anthropological little assessment in Muncie, Indiana, and their fears seem to have been confirmed with a number of college girls there who contended that they had had sex prior to marriage, and so forth. It was seen as a clarion call to conservative America that something needs to be done, and in particular, something needs to be done to control the women. And in the big picture, you had Mary Pickford had once been the leading lady, and she was always the damsel in distress, etc. Right? But now, in the 1920s, the leading women were not so. You look at the end of the 20s with Louise Brooks, and she kind of joked about how many men she had been with, and how many men she had spurned, and just wanted a fling with them and nothing more. And so again, the conservatives worried about this. And then you also have conservatives who were racist, and not all of them were, right? Because different conservatives chose different battlefields to fight. But those who fought against the Harlem Renaissance oftentimes had at least a tinge, if not blatantly, carried with them racist sentiment. It unnerved them that the African Americans, especially with jazz music, were, because you had jazz music, you have the types of vaudeville acts that were being played. You had leading women that became very popular across the country, like Josephine Baker. If you even just Google Josephine Baker, a lot of the pictures, she will be scarcely if clad at all. She was seen as like a sex diva, a sex symbol. And so at any rate, also at some of these dance halls, you had integration. You had black and white young men and women dancing together. And of course, there had been anti-miscegenation laws, anti-interethnic sex laws from the colonial time period down in the South. And so at any rate, people were concerned that African culture was leading America to its ruin, that it was kind of a hedonistic, right? Like just live for pleasure and nothing else, live for the moment type of lifestyle. And they said the same thing about Hollywood. All right. And so yeah, you have all these things going on. And then you also had, and I show here like the more factual data behind the origin of the Harlem Renaissance. The origin of it was meant to be something grander than entertainment. Okay. It was to prove the culture creating capacity of African Americans, because that was used by the anti-Black South, as it was used through Adolf Hitler, contending that on the alleged, with the oppression, arguing the alleged inferiority of the quote African race, saying that they had never been able to build a civilization on their own, etc., etc. Never mind ancient Egypt and Timbuktu with the Mali Empire, etc. But at any rate, that's what they contended. And so with African Americans, they were trying to earn their way in to Americana socially, right? By proving their culture creating capacity. All right. And then with the prohibition of alcohol, right? It's going to be the 18th and 20th Amendments. You have the arguing that under the Volstead Act, anything 0.1% alcoholic or above is considered alcoholic. So they had to take like cough medicine off the shelves, etc. It was so strictly, inaugurated. But the argument was, you had one mayor in Chicago who contended that he was not going to enforce it, that it was ridiculous, it was unenforceable, and that it was unconstitutional, etc. And so you had some leaders who were even saying they weren't going to abide by it. And then, of course, you have its lack of popularity and its enforcement capacity. As you see here, the government employed only 3,000 agents across the country. They only spent $2 billion per year. I know that sounds like a lot, but even for back then, that was not that much. And so they had to rely largely upon the states for enforcement. And like I said, different states varied completely in their cooperation with this prohibition amendment in the Volstead Act. And so you have that. You have the increase of bootlegging and with the mafia. And so, of course, you have, Chicago really stands out because of all the major public gunfights with Al Capone, Peg Leg Lonergan, Irish guy named O'Bannon. They're just constantly, the Irish and the Italians are fighting one another. And then the Italians were fighting amongst one another, like with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and so forth. It's just, it got pretty crazy. And so, they were put on Time magazine. Al Capone was, as if he were a hero, but yet it's supposed to be illegal, right? And so talk about mixed messages from the 20s culture, right? And so just if you want to look into that question. So then I get more into the economics here at the end. Okay, so different changes. Warren G. Harding and his scandals of his administration. He also had the Teapot Dome scandal and the scandals of having affairs with other women. And with the Teapot Dome scandal, it was just one cabinet member of his, a friend, signed oil reserves from one department to another. And then that friend offered the oil out to a mutual friend who had a private oil company, and they all cut the profits. They all split the profits. And so, that was just one of several scandals that were going on in the 1920s, early 20s, with Warren G. Harding's administration. All right, and so looking here, to what extent it was accurate, to whatever extent it was accurate, what factors do you believe may have contributed to women's empowerment, liberation, or defiance of Victorian norms? So again, I put a few things in there in parentheses, etc. So again, you could look at change in education and higher education for women. You could look at change of employment and income for unmarried women. You have an increase in those number of women who either waited late to marry or did not marry at all. You had an increase in divorce in the 1920s as well. You had, and by the way, though, I want to qualify this for the test. A lot of people still do not contend that it goes so far as to contending that women gained total self-sufficiency economically during the 1920s. There's just evidence against it. So relative to before, to the 19-teens, they were greatly empowered economically, but still not to the point, by and large, on average, that they could literally afford to stay single and never marry. Okay. You also have things like ideologically, Freud and his notions, right, of crushing the id. And a lot of people in the 20s kind of, instead of finding a balance, like what I remember reading with Freud, and balancing following your id and following your superego that tells you right and wrong, the 20s popularly kind of misinterpreted it. And it was kind of known that you have to follow your id, your passion, your instinct. You have to just go with it and find physical fulfillment in life because it's fleeting, etc. So you have, kind of a misuse of Freud at that time, supposedly. The media is trying to help the new woman out. They had a new look about them with Coco Chanel's flapper attire, right? They can become identifiable now and feel a sense of camaraderie with one another and dressing up in their flapper attire and cutting and bobbing their hair, etc. The automobile. A lot of people blame the automobile by giving a lot of independence to young men and women. And then postmodernism contended that there is no such thing as right or wrong. There is no such thing as truth. And what was percolating in the arts and academia at that time. So just a few examples there. All right. So if you choose that one, just look up, like the new woman of the 1920s, and see what you could find. See what you find as far as the different primary and secondary sources. And I expect you to find mainly secondary sources, which is fine. So not from that time period, not direct quotes, etc. If you do, that's even better. That's great. All right. Number two, you're just choosing one. To what extent did the Harlem Renaissance earn popular or institutional respect, tolerance, or inclusion for African Americans? Now, this one is it's complex, right? Because when you look at social integration, you find lots of white folk storming in to Harlem itself to support this Renaissance. A lot of white readers buying novels written by Langston Hughes and these other African American writers, Count Colin, Claude McKay. Okay, you have those, but at the same time, how many states changed their racist legislation? And to me, I think that matters. Subjectively, me, I think that matters. How many states actually changed racist laws, etc., and practices. Also, to what extent did African Americans join the middle class? Because that was another big hope amongst the leaders of the NAACP when they began the Harlem Renaissance, and before, just at the beginning of the 1920s. All right. And then you also have the identity crisis faced by some writers in their own writing of the Harlem Renaissance, like, again, Langston Hughes, Count Colin, Claude McKay, when they wrote basically that they through their protagonist of their fictional writings, their books, that in some of their books, their protagonist ends up disillusioned by the end of the novel because he tried to join white middle-class urban America. He tried to prove to them that he was just as sophisticated, just as intelligent, just as well-read, etc. But then finds that it's to no avail, that the color of his skin is a life sentence that he cannot extricate himself from. And so then there's this sense of like, well, fine, then I'm just going to be proud of being Black, and the nation could take me, have me, or not have me. And so, again, I think that's an interesting one. Go whatever direction you want. Why do you think prohibition failed? Well, we believe it failed because 2 amendments later, they ended it, right? There's a lot of evidence of defiance of prohibition. And so why do you think it failed? So I gave a short-lived little take on it, that there weren't enough resources, in particular, to back it up, that the generation itself was very kind of libertine in the 1920s. That is just, I know that's the court image, and that's just one image, but it seems to really be prevalent, that the 1920s generation was out to have a good time. That was a bit perhaps hedonistic. All right. So you think of that, perhaps prohibition was instituted for the wrong reasons. You could look into that, et cetera, et cetera. All right. And then number 4, if you choose this one, to what extent were the traditionalist concerns reasonable or justified? You could go just one direction or another on one issue. You could show the extent to which they were reasonable on one issue and not reasonable on another. So the issues we've talked about, right, are the new woman and the youth culture, the Harlem Renaissance, and of course, prohibition of alcohol. And then you also had another field was Darwinism taught in the public schools. You had the Scopes trial. A guy named Scopes agreed with the NAACP to teach against Dayton, Tennessee's law that said you shall not teach exospecies evolution to the sophomore kids at the high schools in that city. And he did anyway. So the school district fired him. And the NAACP, or the not the NAACP, the ACLU defended him, and it became a highly publicized trial, which was supposed to be supposedly about sovereignty over a curriculum, right? Do the parents get to decide? Does the school board get to decide? The superintendent, or to what extent is there academic freedom for teachers, etc., right? But instead it became basically a holy war, because exospecies evolution goes against the accounts of the book of Genesis in the Bible, right? That people were created by God as human beings and not as a primate. And so at any rate, this was a big deal, you guys. It was a big deal in the 20s. Let's see here. And then number 5, to what extent did hedonism or irresponsible decision-making or behavior during the 20s contribute to the Great Depression? And that's just a very popular interpretation. There are quite a few others, okay? But that is one. And so look into, I was able to find, like, you have the evidence of how many Americans had any kind of savings at the end of the 20s, and it was like 2%. It was ridiculous. How many Americans bought on credit their furniture, their automobile, and other things, and that was just astronomically high. And so you look to the point of the farmers farming more of their arable land than was normally considered wise to do so. So oftentimes, right, you leave 1/3 of your land to lay fallow to replenish the nutrients. And a lot of the cash crop farmers in the 20s, they got caught up in this boom, and their wheat and other farm products were selling very well here and in Europe. And so they started, using all of their arable land, and they took a risk in doing that. And then suddenly there's not the same demand for that farm produce. Okay. The stockbrokers, how they were selling stock on margin, right? So that you don't have to put a penny down. You just borrow the money and buy stock. And then once the stock goes up, then you pay from what you had borrowed, right? But what happens if the stock doesn't go up? And so there was that type of irresponsible behavior with stockbrokers and people in the stock market. And you have the banks, and the people with the banks were taking our money, and there was no FDIC yet as far as guaranteeing a certain degree, certain proportion of your deposit. And they were lending it out and gambling in the stock market, etc., with people's deposit money. And so the banks perhaps were hedonistic and irresponsible as well. So at any rate, just you're just choosing one of these 5. And then I'd like you to be able to just, probably just online, which is okay with me, find a source or two, a good site or two, a reputable one, please not Wikipedia. Okay. And that helps give you that has perhaps a definitive thesis on one of these questions, and more importantly, gives you an answer why, gives you supportive data as to why. So does anybody have any questions? All right, so I'm just asking for at least one page. So I know it's not a great research project. If it were, I would give you much more time than 1 week. All right, do you guys feel okay? Can I get any kind of feedback? You guys feel okay about this? Like to begin to start to research one of them?
Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you, Marisol. Kirsten, thank you. So I hope that I gave you enough general information to just let you make an educated decision as far as, so that hopefully you know a little bit about each of these questions, enough that you know where your interest is, and maybe even know what type of data you're already going to begin to look for, etc. I look forward to these. I like reading these from the students. This different format. All right, you guys. Well, that's it for me. This is usually a shorter one with the Roaring 20s because it's just a little intro and a few questions. So if you guys don't have any other questions, I'm probably going to let you go if that's okay. But I wish you guys well. I hope that you find at least one of these questions remotely interesting. Because when you choose one that you find interesting, it absolutely, I think it helps you with your effort and everything. You'll do a better job. All right. Okay, you guys. So that's it for me, okay? I hope that's okay.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Have a good one.
I have a question about our analysis papers.
Yes.
Are you still grading those and giving feedback and such?
Yeah, I'm far behind on your class. I'm so sorry, Alex.
That's okay. I just wanted to make sure that I was doing it correctly and everything.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'll try to play catch up though, okay?
Okay. I've actually already done my paper for this week, so I'm glad that it worked out how
wow.
you were
Good
wanting.
for you. That's
But
wonderful.
thank you very much.
All right, Alex. I look forward to reading it.
Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.